All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to, as Phil was saying, the 7th edition of the Believers, Non-Believers in Discussion series, and where we're bringing together panelists with some religious and non-religious views to talk about some of the bigger topics that are floating around in everybody's head and get everybody's sort of opinions on this and see kind of where we land and if we can come to any sort of consensus on where we should believe about these things. My name is Michael Kane. As Phil mentioned, I am the host of the Free Religion podcast. I am a secular and atheistic activist. So I'm sort of out here in Riverside doing some things, and Phil was so nice to ask me to come in and sit and moderate this for you guys. I'm super excited to hear both sides of this. The anthropology and the paleontology sides of this really kind of fascinate me, so I think it'll be a fun and exciting discussion. But enough about me. Please, let's move along to why we're here today. As you guys have seen from the title of this discussion, we've got some people, famous individuals such as Ken Ham, who like to have a question of, can you actually know what happened in history with any kind of certainty if you weren't there? What kind of methods can you use to determine truth about things that have happened in the past? And so today we're going to have that discussion and see kind of what different methodologies people use to determine truth in history and see if we can come to any sort of consensuses. So this afternoon we have on our panel, we have Mr. Jim Walker, Mr. Steve Wiper, Miss Billy, and it is Guerrero, and Dr. Marilyn Fogel. So thank you guys for coming out. Jim, I'll give our introductions real quick for everybody. Jim has a BS in Electrical Engineering from Drexel University and a Master's of Science in Systems Management from USC. Jim comes to us with a little over 40 years in aerospace technology and with 4 years as an actual rocket scientist. So you don't get to say that much, right? Jim is also a dedicated follower of Christ for more than 60 years. And when he's not building rockets in his backyards, he's playing one of 6 musical instruments, running, hiking, cycling, traveling, or reading, and presumably not all at once. Steve has a BA in history from the University of Redlands and a Master's of the Arts in Theological Studies from Talbot Seminary at Biola University. Steve is also a Vietnam veteran. Thank you for your service, sir. Steve is currently retired, or refreshed, as he prefers to say. Steve was a public school teacher for almost 40 years, taught AP courses in government and U.S. history, honors world history, U.S. history, economics, anthropology, ancient history, medieval history, modern history. In other words, Steve is really bad at math, right? Steve has also been a Christ follower for a little more than 70 years, and as part of his refreshing, Steve likes to swim, read up on religion, theology, philosophy, history, and sciences. On this side of our table, we have Billy Guerrero. Billy is a graduate of Chaffey College and an undergraduate and teaching assistant at the University of La Verne. She is the Skeletal Collections Curator and Coordinator at the University of La Verne, president of the Lambda Alpha Anthropology Honor Society, and a volunteer at the Raymond M. Alf Museum of Paleontology. This summer, she's going to be going to Africa to do paleoanthropological fieldwork in Kenya. Yeah, I practiced that the whole way up here and still got it wrong. All right, and lastly, but not least, we have Dr. Marilyn Fogel. Fogel? Yes? Okay. Last names kill me. Dr. Fogel is with the Weber M. Mayhew Endowed Professor of Geology at the University of Riverside, UC Riverside, and director at the Edge Institute. Dr. Fogel has her PhD in marine botany from the University of Texas at Austin and a BS in biology. Dr. Fogel specializes in isotope biochemistry and ecology, paleontology, and astrobiology. Did I leave anything out? No? Probably a lot. I bet so. So all that being said, thank you guys for being here today. We really appreciate it. We're really looking forward to getting this going. And basically, like I said, what we're doing here is to have a discussion about historical sciences. I'm going to give everybody about a 5, 7, 10-minute window to kind of open up and basically go through how you personally feel like we determine truth about our past. How do we actually know what we know? And how do we determine what's true and what's possibly not true? Like Phil said, we're going to end this with a Q&A for the audience. So when this is over and we're all wrapped up, if you guys have any questions, if you can just line up at the mic over here, we'll walk through, let you guys ask the questions, and we'll see what kind of amazing answers we get out of our panelists here. So, Jim, I'm going to let you fire it off and get us started.
All righty, I was figuring you'd go ladies first. I could get a format fill.
I'm right-handed.
Yes. All right. Hi, guys. I'm Jim. I am a science buff. That's about the best, well, I guess it's the best you can say. I came that close to a degree in mathematics if I had stayed one more semester. So I'm heavy on math, ate calculus for breakfast. You know, the whole shot. Total geek. And I'm proud of it. I should be. I want to give a couple of words about how people think. How do we reason? We reason in three different ways. We reason through what's known as the inductive method, which I'll explain in a minute. We reason through the deductive method, and we also reason through the abductive method. Each has their place. It's not one is right and one is wrong. They're just different styles for different things. Inductive is basically saying, okay, is something testable? Is something repeatable? That's for basically physical sciences that we can get our hands on. Is hydrogen lighter than oxygen? Or something very simple. Does ivory soap float? Straightforward question. Those of you that are old enough know their slogan. What was it? It floats. Anyway, this is something that if I were going to make a hypothesis, if I were going to make an assertion about ivory soap, I would say ivory soap floats. And you challenge me on that, I'd say, let's get a tub of water, you drop in the ivory soap. What happens? It floats. You drop it, well, that's not a very exhaustive test. Let's drop it in cold water. Let's drop it in hot water. Let's drop it in salty water. Let's drop it in deionized water. You test it every way you can think of. Every time it floats, have you proven it scientifically? No. Science is really hard to prove. Even ivory soap floats. You've made a 99% case. Have you thought of every possible condition under which you could test ivory soap? No. Have you tested it with a 525 nanometer laser exciting the water? Have you tested it with a magnetic field at 2001 hertz? I won't get into the why, but if you haven't thought of every possible test, all we can say is we're 99% sure that we've proven inductively that ivory soap floats. That's inductive proofs, used largely by the physical sciences to say, you know, this stuff that happens. We analyze it, we measure it, and we test it. Deductive reasoning goes sort of like this, and we use it all the time, but not directly in science. We would say all mammals have hearts. Is that statement true? You put a second statement with it. Dolphins are mammals. If both of those statements are true, then we can deductively reason that dolphins have hearts. Deductive reasoning is 100% solid. If your two premises or three or however many you have are solid, deductive reasoning is solid. You can take it to the bank. The third type of reasoning we use is something called abductive reasoning when we weren't there. When a detective comes on a crime scene, he says, well, I see the body, I see the candlestick, I see fingerprints, I see DNA, but you weren't there. So what does abductive reasoning do? You say, well, I want multiple hypotheses for how this happened. Well, the butler did it is always a good guess. The wife did it, the husband did it. We put together different hypotheses, then you say, which hypothesis explains all of the data? You say, well, it wasn't the butler because it was his day off and he was down at the beach with friends. Or, you know, you go through and finally say, well, abductively we reason that this is the best explanation. Is abductive reasoning 100%? No, it's not. We weren't there. We don't have a videotape of it, not that they could ever be faked, not that you've ever seen a fake video on YouTube. So what we have to do is say, is this the best explanation? Now, a practical example of abductive reasoning is this. You just got your 6-month-old down for a nap. You finally take a breath. Then you hear crying from the baby's room. You go to the door and you smell a nasty smell. What do you abduce? Well, maybe somebody snuck in and sprayed nasty smell in the room. And maybe that's what woke up the baby. No, you just think automatically, that baby's got a job in the diapers, let's deal with it and be done with it. So abductive reasoning is something we do day in, day out, often without thinking. You drive into a parking lot and you see 5 different cars in the lane in front of you. What do you abduce? There's no parking there. You've got to go out to the lunatic fringe to park. So abductive reasoning is something that we do all the time automatically, and we basically use our experience, because you've had a kid with a dirty diaper before, you've tried to park at Kohl's Plaza during Christmas before, you bring your experience with you, you evaluate the clues, and you say, what scenario makes the best sense? Does it satisfy everything? And you sometimes say, well, this is the best we've got until other evidence comes along that might change it. By the way, the role model for this type of thinking is not from Sir Conan Doyle, who wrote who? Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes did not invent abductive reasoning. My source for abductive reasoning is a gentleman by the name of Charles Darwin, who basically said that. He said, when you see a bunch of evidence, when you see a bunch of stuff, take records, take photos, take data, whatever you've got, then put together multiple hypotheses. I'm looking for several explanations. Which one explains all the data? Then, if new data comes along a day later, a week later, a month later, you may have to change your opinion. I'll read his quote in just a second. This happens, people are in prison, and this guy's in there for life for murdering somebody. And then what happens? That was in the year, 1985. They discover new DNA evidence, because DNA is a lot better now than it used to be, and they discovered this guy didn't do it. New evidence comes along, you may have to change your opinion, or in this case, the verdict. Here's a quote from Mr. Charles Darwin's page 473 from his book. I test this hypothesis, which in this case was universal common descent, by comparison with as many general and pretty well established propositions, multiple hypotheses, as I can find, in geographic distribution, geologic history, affinities, etc. And it seems to me that, supposing that such a hypothesis were to explain such general propositions, we ought, in accordance with the common way of following all sciences, to admit it until some better hypothesis is found. That is abductive reasoning. So that's that's my background thing for how we reason, inductively, deductively, and abductively.
All right, thanks, sir. Appreciate that. For our second introduction, we'll probably just continue straight on around the tables, and I will let Steve get his 5 or 7 minutes in.
Well, if you haven't figured it out, I'm out of my element. There are 3 scientists here, and I am not a scientist. I'm a historian and a quasi-philosopher, a quasi-apologist, and a quasi-theologian. So anyway, I have fun with that. I've been involved in the creation-evolution debate since the early 70s. When I came back from Vietnam, I went to the school I was teaching at, Corona Junior High, and I was teaching certain things, and a biology teacher at that school happens to be here today, and he came up to my room and said, "What are you teaching in class?" And so we had about a year or two of discussion and debate in the creation-evolution area. So I deal with it from a historical perspective, not a scientific perspective, because I don't think it is a scientific problem. It's a historical problem. In fact, I did like math. I started out as a math major and found out I was not good at math when I got to analytical trigonometry. I go, oh.
Hang on, wait, did I abduct that or deduct that or induct that? I'm not, how did I get? Okay, I'll be clear by the end of the day.
But anyway, I went to the University of Redlands, and I'm sitting in the counselor's office, and he says, "What's your major going to be?" And I don't know what happened, but I said history. I hated history all through school with an absolute passion. And I walked out of that office with just What did I do to myself? It should have been PE. I was a jock all my life, but I said history. And it's been a great subject to study and to deal with. So like I said, I've been involved in the creation evolution debate for approximately 30 years. I've had a chance to debate several biologists. One of my famous debates was with Frank. Oh, now I just forgot his name. I hate it when I forget names. When you get old, you forget names. Anyway, he was a physics professor from down in Chapman, and he was secretary of the Humanist Society. So we had a 3-4 hour debate at the Unitarian Universalist Church, which was a very interesting debate. So, but I had a lot of fun doing it. My emphasis, obviously, is not science, and I'm already intimidated by all the artifacts that she's got here sitting on the table. Oh my goodness, what do we do with that? Bury them. But anyway, my emphasis is dealing with that which is undergirding the interpretation of the facts. We all live in the same reality, whether we like it or not. And in that reality, we all deal with the same evidences and the same facts. But as the old statement goes, it's not the facts that divide men, it's the interpretation of the facts. And that's what we have to deal with. Even in communities, you have differences of interpretation. Jim and I don't agree on everything.
True.
Yeah.
And he's wrong.
And he has the right, he has the right to be wrong. And we teach creation, evolution, Genesis 1, apologetics issues, and so forth, and we'll do that all the time. You know, he makes a statement, well, you have the right to be wrong on that, and he'll come back at me with the same thing. But you have differences within communities. You have, in our particular area, we have the old earth, we have the young earth. We have the theistic evolutionist. We have various areas within that. And my position is basically they're all wrong when they deal with Genesis 1. And I have a different understanding of Genesis 1. So there are differences. There are differences with the atheist community and so forth. I've just finished with Thomas Nagel's, I forgot the title of the book. Anyway, he disagrees with the whole concept of evolution now. Several scientists that are with the intelligent design movement are atheists, but they do not agree with the evolution paradigm. So there are differences, but we have the same facts that we're dealing with. So what makes these differences? What undergirds all of this? And there are, of course, multiple factors. And because of the nature of man, no matter what the issue is or what the fact is, there's going to be a point, counterpoint. And so we have to determine what is true on the basis of the information that we have. Undergirding that is that there are many worldviews that we deal with. And so I'm very interested and have done a lot with worldviews in my classroom. As you know, I taught almost 40 years. And one of my big things was preparing kids for college to understand that all professors have a worldview that they're dealing with. And you need to understand their presuppositions. And so there's multiple worldviews, they're contradictory with one another, so they can't all be right. So we get into a philosophical area there. And then undergirding that, within the worldviews, there are certain basic big questions that we've all got to deal with. And of course, the biggest question is the existence or non-existence of God. And that undergirds just about every interpretation that we have. Some of the issues that we have to deal with in big questions is why is there something rather than nothing? That can't be dealt with on the basis of science. It's done from philosophy, reason, and certain other kinds of things. And then why is the earth, why is the world the way it is and not some other way? These are issues that just about everybody all through history has to deal with in some form and in some way. What is the purpose for our existence? What is the purpose of my existence, of your existence? These, again, are questions that we have to deal with all the time. What should I believe and why should I believe it? How should I behave and why should I behave that way? What's this?
That's okay. He's letting me know. Go ahead. Finish.
Huh? Oh, okay. I'll
Talk faster.
You're fine.
talk faster. You feel like Jim and I help kids give apologetic speeches, and they get 6 minutes, and they hold up fingers like this, and you go, "Wow, am I in class?" But anyway, there is, I believe, an ultimate truth. That's what humanity is seeking, that concept of ultimate truth. And we develop methodologies to determine what that is in science, in history, philosophy, religion. There are certain methodologies, and basically it gets down to the idea of hermeneutics, which is principles of interpretation, and the problem of exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis is drawing interpretation out of the material you have. Eisegesis is reading into the material, what you have. So you have to be aware of those kinds of things. And so with that, I'll say, concluding with Jim, is that we are both Christ followers, and therefore our worldview is admittedly theistic, biblical, and Jesus followers. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. All right. Next up, we have Billy Guerrero.
All right. Well, I would just to give a little bit of background about me. I was a believer as well at one point, but then I started to find some things in the Bible that I didn't agree with morally, and that's what led me to fall out of that. It wasn't actually the theory of evolution that got me out of my belief system. It was just the Bible. So, but I'm just going to go to the question at hand here, the methodologies of historical sciences. As someone who deals with paleontology and paleoanthropology, I've become familiar of how to draw inferences. And one thing I want to make clear is that historical sciences don't deal with absolutes. Science in general does not deal with absolutes, and we don't claim to know the absolute truth. And if anybody tells you they have the absolute truth, they probably don't have the absolute truth. There is no absolute truth. But so inferences is the best that we can have. And so how do we draw those inferences? So I'm going to really quickly introduce someone. So this right here, just from a show of hands, if you know who this is, you don't have, just based off what you see, I would like to ask the audience if you think this is more ape-like or more human-like. So just by a show of hands, who thinks it's more ape-like? Okay. Who thinks it's more human-like? Okay, I would say you're all right. This is actually the famous Lucy. So she's an Australopithecine afarensis, and she was found in the Awash Valley of the Afar Triangle. And this was in Ethiopia. So when we found Lucy, she was about 40% of the skeleton was found, but enough of it was found to draw inferences. So she, as you can see, has a very prognathic face, meaning her face sticks out. Okay, so this is not part of the genus Homo, so we're part of the genus Homo. Genus Homo just means large brain. This is a small-brained hominin. Hominins are us and our bipedal ancestors. You can see a high brow ridge here, and you can see a very large jaw, but a very small brain, very chimp-like brain. And this is just to compare it to a human here, where you can see the differences. And you guys can look at this afterwards and pick them up. I don't mind. They're casts of the original. So we have found over 300 of these Australopithecines afarensis individuals. And one of the things that we can tell from the skull, just the skull alone, is that it was walking upright. So how can we tell that it was walking upright? Well, there's a clue in the skull that will tell you that, and that's called the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is located right underneath the skull, and it is where your spine connects to. And as you can see in Lucy, it's almost centered. And if you compare that to a modern chimp, so this is a male chimp here, it is more towards the back of the skull. Okay, this is a huge difference from a human skull that's right underneath it. So there's some differences there. quadrupeds and bipeds walking on two legs, have the foramen, bipeds have the foramen magnum located right underneath the skull for the spine attachment. That's not the only thing that we can actually look at to see if something was walking upright. We could also look at other features of Lucy's skeleton to see if they were walking upright. We could look at femurs. So this is a human femur here, and as you can see, if we put it down, it goes at an angle, right? You see that angle here? And if we look at this is a bonobo femur, and it's pretty much straight. It does not go at an angle. So what does Lucy's look like? Very angled. So we can tell through bipeds, us, and more quadrupedal animals, here, bonobo, that whether something was walking upright. If you see an angle, it's probably walking upright. Another thing that you can look at is the huge difference between pelvises. This is a human pelvis. This is a female pelvis. So how do we know that Lucy was a female? As you could tell in the pelvis. The pelvis is a great, leaves behind clues about that. So there's what's called the sciatic notch, which is in the pelvis here, and a wide notch will tell you if it's a female. Females usually have wider hips. These human pelvises are wider. They're shorter compared to this is a chimp pelvis, which is long, as you can see, and very narrow. So this is all of these skeletal features that have occurred over past millions of years, because Lucy is 3.2 million years old. This specific specimen is 3.2 million years old. She was done. The way that we found out it was 3.2 million years old was through Aragon dating methods. So Aragon dating methods, I won't get into the whole chemistry of it, but I could if you guys want me to. But basically, she was found in between two layers of volcanic ash, and volcanic ash are perfect for dating. The analysis was done a little later after Lucy was found because they had to perfect it a little bit, but this was back in the 70s, so they were still working out some tweaks on the dating methods. So Lucy was also said to have a lot of ape-like features, so I showed kind of the humanistic features that you see in Lucy, but she also had long arms, and she also had curved digits. So her digits were not able to be straight like ours. So if you try to straighten out a chimp's fingers, they'll break if you do that. But they're permanently curved. That's because they're arboreal, meaning they go in the trees. So that's another feature that Lucy had. And through our understanding of evolution, this makes sense. We find this is just one transitional fossil I'm talking about. We find many, many transitional fossils, and really every fossil we found would be a transitional fossil. It's between one species and another species. So those are some of the things that we can look at through skeletal analysis to tell you who Lucy was, a little bit about how she was walking, a little bit about how old she is. They actually have just found out that she had died from falling off a tree, but that's still debated. And I know that in the sciences, a lot of things are debated, but I always find that that's a beauty of science, is that they don't deal with truths, and that was very different when I went from a religious background where the truth was known, and then I went to a science background where truth is totally unsure. And things are always up for question, things are always changing, and that might put some people off because people want to know the answers, and all we can give you is the best explanations, and that should be fine because like I said, we can't really know for sure, but all we can do is draw these inferences, and there are things left behind. Historical scientists are more like detectives in that way, where they come to a scene, as we were talking about that line of reasoning, but it doesn't mean that it does not have experimental methods or that it doesn't have any observable things, because we could observe the pelvis, we could observe the skulls, we could observe the femurs, there's many other features that we could observe in Lucy, the knees, the feet, those are all things we can observe and draw inferences from. So this is actually the first time I came across there was a difference between observational and or experimental sciences and historical sciences, because for me they've always been a mashup of the both. So that's where I'll start.
Perfect. That was dead on. Thank you. Outstanding. All right. Thank you very much. And last but not least.
I'm next. Okay. So as far as religion goes, I'll tell you that I am a great fan of Pope Francis. And I follow his writings and his view on evolution, which he believes is, I think, one of our top religious leaders, that it is very much in keeping with what the Bible says. So I'm going to leave it at that. My training is first as a biologist. I went to Penn State University. I got there, I started learning biology, and for some reason I took a class in earth science and went over to find out that, what's going on with the earth science. And they had just discovered, at that time, it was in the early 1970s, some small microscopic fossils in very ancient rocks were the evidence they found for life on Earth, which was, about that time it was thought to be about 1.4 billion years old. And from that point on, I always took my sense of biology and what's happening on the Earth now so that I could understand what happened back in the past. So for my career, what I did is got my PhD at the University of Texas down in Port Aransas on a small island. I picked up a lot of chemistry, and from there, I have a laboratory here that I'm building at UC Riverside. I came from UC Merced. I had a laboratory there, and in Washington. And the laboratory is set up so that we measure very small and very accurate and precise measurements of the chemical parameters of all the organic chemicals that are in living organisms, from humans to microbes. And we take what we know from the modern environment, we go out, we find fossils, things that are bones. I've analyzed bones, teeth, eggshells, you name it. So we can clearly relate biology with biology, and then go back further in time where all you have in your hand is a rock. A gray rock. Rocks always kind of look gray to me. I need the right people. But from the chemical signatures in there, I'm able to make a pretty darn good guess as to the environment that living organisms lived in, maybe what they were, and working with other scientists date those rocks. Now, our big questions, going from there, understanding what's happened on the Earth, I've gone even farther, and that is the study of astrobiology. And our big question is, are we alone in the universe? And I think that links up with your big questions of, is there a God? And, if there is another world somewhere out there, is there a God for that world, or is it the same God? We still argue here as scientists as to when. We don't know how life was created on Earth. There is no opinion on that. We still fight about when the exact date where we have strong evidence about when we can find when life originated on Earth. The number is between 3.8 billion. Some people will go to 4 billion. Some will go to 3.5 billion. And these numbers sound vague, probably, when you throw around billions of years. But we still all fight about this. What we do know is that life originated a heck of a long time ago. That we can tell, okay? And so it doesn't disturb me that we don't have an exact date, that I don't know whether there was life on Mars or whether there is currently life on Mars. But these are the questions that I think that probably dovetail with, on the more religious side, is that we know what we have on Earth, what is out there in the rest of the universe, and they're all fascinating questions, and how we could all link together, I think, is really the way in which this argument probably should be happening.
Thank you very much. That was very nice. Appreciate that. So really, we want this to be a discussion between you two, and you two really kind of the experts in the field. I'm just kind of here to make sure nobody throws anything, and hopefully that doesn't. Starts
I have
early.
to say, if you read Pearls Before Swine this morning, the cartoon, did you see that one?
No.
Where there was two people on a panel and they threw grenades.
Oh, nice.
You got to see that one.
I guess whoever throws it first is right?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to throw kind of a starter question out for you guys because I'm also ex-religious. I grew up in the Nazarene and Baptist churches in the South, so I have a lot of that fire and brimstone kind of upbringing, very literal biblical interpretation kind of history. And so my kind of first question to get you guys kicked off is, do you feel that revelation is a valid form of evidence? Do you feel there's anything that can be I guess, ethereally validated that counts as actual evidence in historical sciences? Because you guys seem to come from that background, you come from that background. I was just curious kind of how you guys fall into that thought process.
Take it. There's various concepts of revelation. And so, in fact, I deal with this in my history classroom. I tell students that you cannot know me unless I reveal myself to you. We see each other fractions of seconds later than we actually are. Isn't that true? And then we look at stars and they're a lot older than the light that we actually, or we see the light that's old, actually the star is older. Anyway, revelation is important. There's various types of revelation. I will say, you signed up for this class and it's got this name on there, Wiper. You don't know anything about who the teacher is. I walk into the classroom and you can make all kinds of presuppositions, assumptions, and so forth about who this guy is. Well, obviously he's male, he's old, he's fat, and so you've got some revelation to understand a little bit about who the person is that walked in the room. But you don't know I'm the teacher yet. So I begin to speak and give instructions to the class and syllabus for the class. So I'm giving a little bit more revelation of myself. And then still, you don't know who I am and you don't know me. You don't know me like my wife knows me. My wife is here. We're on our 50th year of wedding. So anyway, she knows me pretty well. And the students don't. So there's various kinds of revelation. And I personally believe that if God does exist, and I believe he does, that God is not just going to leave us, but will find ways to accommodate his intelligence, his creation to us in various ways. So I'll just leave it at that. I can go on long.
Let me put in a not quite a random thought, because although I do that. So we've come from different backgrounds religiously. I come from a particular denomination that happens to be in Redlands. So we're a long way from you guys. There is, in our church, the belief that there is a central core of beliefs. And you could probably recite them off the top of your head. Christ is the Son of God, the second coming of Christ, salvation to Christ and the gospel. You've heard all this. Outside of this, there is a wider ring of things that are fun to discuss. Truly fun. And he and I get in on this. And we don't always agree on this outer ring of stuff that says, okay, you could get into theological, hair splitting. It's fun, but it's not the central core. And Steve and I agree on the central core, but out here, there's some things we disagree on. We have lunch every Friday, and we don't always agree. We kick it around. He's wrong some of the time. And so that's just my short perspective that in terms of religious background, be it Catholic, Episcopal, Pentecostal, mainline evangelistic, Southern hellfire and brimstone, there's a central core of belief. Outer here, there's a lot of things. This may surprise you, some religions believe you need to be dunked under the water to be baptized. Some sprinkle. Can you imagine that? Yes, you can, because it happens all the time. And that's
squirt guns.
Yeah, I suppose. That's an outer ring, not to be confused with the central ring. So a lot of these things, the age of the earth, the age of the universe, is an outer ring discussion. Now, people that try to bring the outer ring into the central ring, I think, do everybody a disservice.
That's
Just
interesting.
just to add a little bit to the whole idea of revelation there. Those skulls there give us something in order to deal with. They have revealed themselves. If they didn't exist, how would you even have a discussion about what was being talked about? Things have to exist and reveal themselves for us to understand.
I feel like maybe we're conflating discovery and observation and revelation. So if someone comes into you and says, I know this thing occurred in the past because, I hear it, or I think it, or it was just divinely inspired upon me, is that as valid a source of evidential data for you guys as would be, piles of skulls and inference of...
Well, maybe for
This
Joan
one.
of Arc it was.
Okay, so really not anymore, maybe. Is that a time that's passed? Is that what you're saying? Like we need a little more than that now?
Not necessarily, but everything reveals itself as to what it is.
Okay.
I mean, and so I think that comes ultimately from that which is creating us.
Excellent. Do you guys have any kind of counterpoints to any of that? Or questions?
What was the question?
Do you feel that revelation, or I guess...
The Book of Revelation?
No, just
Or
revelation in general, just revelation,
Okay.
just sort of
Okay.
divine,
First.
more of the question of if someone was to come into you and say, I know that the evolutionary path of these animals is this direction because I just know, or I'm very confident, or it was given to me in a bush or a bright light, or whatever the concept is that a valid point of evidence for you?
If a revelation is a valid point of evidence?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. Like how you said these skulls would reveal them, that would not allow these conversations to happen. It's funny because before we had a lot of these transitional fossils, Darwin was already talking about these transitional fossils before he even saw them. He thought we should go to Africa and find, because that's where he had pinpointed where they might be. And so but they didn't take his advice and went to places like Asia instead and found things like Neanderthals first, which don't come late. They don't come until later. So we could talk about evolution. We could talk about intermediate species even without having the fossils. The fossils are really just a plus for us because we can see evolution happening with bacteria. We could even see it happening with bigger species as well. If you guys are familiar with the lizards of Pod Makaru, I think it was called. There's 2 islands, and they had moved a population of lizards to one island from another island. So it was 5 pairs of lizards that they moved, and this is off the Croatian coast. And what the first population of lizards were primarily eating insects, and so when they moved them over to another island, they came back to check on them 30-something years later to see how they had adapted to their new island. And this new island was they started to eat more of a vegetarian diet because they didn't have a lot of insects available to them. And we started to see after 30-something years that their heads had gotten bigger, taller, more adapted to eating plants, because plants, as you may know, have cellulose, which is harder to not only digest but to tear into. So we could see those kind of things happening right before us. So we don't really even need fossils to draw revelations from. Like I said, fossils are just a plus. It's very hard to become a fossil. So when we find fossils, it's extraordinary that we have so many, because we have to be buried under the right conditions. But yeah, I think that's the only thing I could really say about that.
I'd like to add a comment about looking at evidence. Question, were they still lizards after 30 years?
Yes, but that's just 30 years.
30 years.
Yeah.
I had a chance to be in a place called Dallas, Texas, in a Texas book depository on the 5th floor. And anybody know where I'm going with this? Yeah, at Dealey Plaza. It turns out that was my freshman year in college. On November 11th, 1963, that President Kennedy was shot. And the Warren Commission had boatloads of evidence. One of the most interesting, turns out one of the motorcycle in the procession, their push-to-talk button got jammed on. which means the transmitter was on the entire time, and they have recordings of the 3 gunshots. And the Warren Commission took a year and 750 people interviewed, and they concluded what? Single shooter. Well, about 4 years ago was the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination. I saw one show on the Science Channel and one on the Crime Something Channel. They took a look at the exact same evidence, and they concluded, no, there's a second shooter. And they did all the reconstructions and the laser sightings and the animations, and they said, absolutely, this proves 2 shooters on the grassy knoll. Then there was another channel that did one that says, yeah, well, we analyzed it to death and said it turns out there was a second shooter, but it was one of the Secret Service men coming from behind. All these guys are looking at the same evidence. And they came out with different conclusions. The one thing that science cannot tell us is who orchestrated. Was his wife mad at him? I think that's what it was. The CIA, was it the FBI, was it Castro, was it the Mafia? Science doesn't give us insight into why. But my point is, and at this I'll quit, we can all look at the same evidence and legitimately come to different conclusions. That's abductive reasoning saying, well, I think this is a stronger case for 2 shooters, I think it's a stronger case for 1, and it'll be debated till the cows come home.
I want to bring this back to Revelations. I don't want to go off on conspiracy theories.
No, I'm not.
Well, okay. Let's bring this back to Revelations. And I would like to, I'm not going to tell you what my religious beliefs are. I told you that I followed the Pope. I should point out that the name Fogel is a common Jewish name. And I want to bring up the fact that there are other gods that other people believe in, such as Buddha, who I think had revelations throughout his lifetime. I think he channeled things from, not just from his personal experiences, but I think that, you know, you really need to, if we're going to go to a religious framework, we should have a very broad religious framework and think about revelations not just in the New Testament version of this, but from many other global experiences that we have.
Sure.
Absolutely. I agree completely. Well, thank you. I guess the counter question for that is, if revelation is relatively useful, I think you guys would agree that it's very useful in certain circles. It sounds like you guys do not feel that scientifically that's going to be useful for revelation. You'd more observation and methodological naturalism kind of stuff. You won't tell us. So how much weight in counterpoint do you feel that observational methodologies hold in historical evidence? So when you're observing, you say, I guess you guys bring up a good point of everybody has the same facts, but we're all getting different interpretations, or we're likely to get interpretations. What would be sort of your primary methodology to make sure that you are being as correct as possible in going through your observational or revealed data to make sure that you're correct?
Well, looking at the fossils, obviously you have several problems. How would, for instance, PhDs in the area of anthropology that are from a creationist point of view look at those? Wouldn't they have a very different interpretation of them? I'm
actually not aware of anthropologists, creationists.
I can give you Arthur Custance as one of them.
I'm sure you could point out instances, like, I'm just not aware of them.
Yeah.
Most of the anthropologists that I meet are not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
well, that's very
creationists.
limited, though, isn't it? But Arthur Custance, an apologist, dealt with skulls and things like that, and he took one of the skulls that he had and gave it to 3 different artists. And he said, I want you to draw what you think this skull is. Because most of the skulls are not like this. They're bits and pieces, and they're put together. And so Custance gave it to 3 different artists, and there were radically 3 different pictures of that same skull. So they had the interpretations. Now, what caused those interpretations? Basically, the presuppositions that went with their thinking. Dating the fossil. If I remember right, the article in 1973, National Geographic, was it? Something like
Lucy
that?
was found in 74, so it's probably
74,
after that.
okay. Yeah, so then, but I remember that they had problems dating with it because they had determined what it was prior to dating. And I said, oh my goodness, this is too old. I mean, this is going before man. So they began to date the strata it was found in, and through, was it potassium argon?
Argon.
Or something?
First it was potassium
Okay,
argon, yeah.
and but I'm not a scientist, but I'm getting close to something. It's okay. But they dated it at an age that was far too beyond what they thought it was. So they went back and they redated it, but they changed the assumptions of how they used the dating method. So these are the things that we have to be aware of that.
Just to come back with that, you're right in that a lot of these skull fragments, they're usually just fragments. Like this one right here, this is Homo erectus, and the brown parts are the actual parts of the skull that was found, and the white parts are the ones that they have put as remodeling them. But we have found a lot of skulls. We never base our inferences on just one specimen that was found, and so what we're able to do is when we find other individuals, put the pieces back together from the same species. But aside from that, they're usually, and the people that reconstruct these are usually very well versed in anatomy and muscle attachment, things like that. And I know I've seen a few reconstructions of modern day people where it's not an exact match, but it's pretty close. And as far as the dating methods go, like I said, they had some problems dating. It was in the 70s. They hadn't perfected dating methods yet. But they originally did use potassium argon, but then later in the 90s, when they had a better dating method, they went back to where she was found, because as paleoanthropologists and paleontologists and geologists, we have to keep really detailed mapping records of where the locality of where it was found. If you do not have locality records, you cannot make, it's basically a dead end fossil. I was looking at a whale vertebrae, and we don't have locality. We can't say this is a dead end fossil. We can't do anything about it. So they went back and they were able to extract the volcanic ash and date that through argon dating methods, and it's a very complex method, but it was taken to several labs, and then a mean was found, and then that's how we determined how old Lucy was. But yeah, so that's basically what I wanted to clear.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to tell you a story now. I spent most of my career working at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C. One of my colleagues, Peter Edgar Hare, he's no longer alive. When he was alive, he was the son of a very prominent Seventh-day Adventist. And at the time when he was ready to go into college, the Seventh-day Adventists sort of, as part of their doctrine, believed in the notion that the world was about 4,800 and some years old. So he and another two young men were sent to, I think it was Pepperdine University at first, and then they went to Caltech, and each of them developed ways of dating old rocks and fossils. So my colleague, Ed Hare, we called him Ed Hare, the church called him Peter Hare. He developed a dating method where you look at the amino acids. Our proteins are made up of amino acids, and they're all in the L form. And when you die, as your bones are buried and things happen, they convert to the right-handed form. And so he dated shells and fossils. His other colleague, Irv Taylor, developed the radiocarbon method for dating fossils, which goes back about 40,000 years. And when they came, they were called in front of all the church elders, and they were told to give their evidence. And they said, sorry, but we find evidence that the earth is at least several 100,000 years old. And they were kind of thrown out of the church for a while. And it was like, And these were devout Christians who were sent by the church. And eventually, by the time things went by, the Seventh-day Adventists had to come to grips with the fact that there was scientific data. This is not saying that the Bible is wrong. This is not saying that the tenets of the Seventh-day Adventists were at all, screwed up or weird. This was just saying that the earth was a little older than you thought, and that this was data over there. And by the time Ed Hare died, I spoke at his funeral in downtown Tacoma Park, Maryland, where he is a revered scientist, and they had rewritten the policy of how they felt science had collaborated with religion.
That's interesting because it brings up sort of the question of, which is more important, I guess, fact or faith. And maybe that's not a fair way to put it, but it's which I guess is more important when you're doing this sort of research. And is it following your faith and getting evidence to fit the faith, or is it following the evidence to where it leads and adjusting faith based on evidence? How do you guys kind of fall into those camps?
I'm going to take my clue from the most famous atheist of the 20th century, Anthony Flew, who said in almost his dying breath, and this is not quoting from CSI, he says, follow the evidence wherever it leads. I believe when I was younger, I believed it because my parents said so and because the preacher said so. At some point you come to an age when you say, yeah, but is that the real deal? I'm a science geek. I eat it for breakfast. I want evidence for what I believe. I believe a strong, rigorous case can be made for the existence of God based on, watch what I don't add, on science, logic, history, philosophy, and math. At which point, did I not mention? Religion. I think the strong case can be made from the sciences, from philosophy, from math, from logic, to say there is a strong case. Is it 100%? No, but you can't get there from here. But I think a very strong case can be made based on reason that reinforces the faith I had as a child. Now, a lot of people don't, it's a lot of work. Because, as somebody said, if you only get one newspaper, get the oppositions. So I have to read what people that don't believe like I believe read. So I'm not coming in ignorance or saying, oh, well, you're an idiot if you believe that. That's not productive. Because there's people way smarter than I am that believe differently than I am. But I would again emphasize that I think a very strong case for the existence of God can be made based on reason, which reinforces what I believe the Word says.
Well, let's don't go necessarily straight to is there God, but if we can kind of maybe stick on the evolutionary anthropological side. In my mind, in my historical background as a Christian, that kind of stuff stands in direct opposition to the belief system that we had. And so in starting to learn this and starting to understand the dating techniques in evolution and seeing the evidence presented, I felt it was intellectually dishonest to continue proclaiming a faith that I wasn't convinced in.
And that's fair. That's
right.
fair.
So more so in this kind of tech context, if you're being given this data and this information, what would keep you from agreeing with the data or the conclusions? Would it be your faith that would keep you from going, or do you feel like the data is just bad?
Follow the evidence.
Okay.
And I would say as a not only observational, but a laboratory and an experimental and a field scientist, that the reason why I think I'm important or relevant along with my colleagues is I have 40 years experience in handling this. It doesn't bother me that I don't have a firm and set conclusion that always we're following multiple hypotheses, as you suggest we should do. Whether I come up with a conclusion, I get new data and it changes tomorrow, that to me is like, that's the way science is moving.
Exactly.
But I do think that I have And we're kind of telling a story, and the story does change, but it was like, but we need to tell that story. I mean, that's like, to me, it's the creative part of being an earth scientist or an astrobiologist, is to, somebody's got to be able to start to make these stories. And I don't think we want to rule out anything in our stories, but but I think that scientists in general love that kind of science.
Science, go ahead.
I just wanted to add a little bit about with everything that's been said, really. So the way that I see it, I think science and religion can answer two different kinds of questions, or faith can answer two different kinds of questions. And when you are basing your beliefs in a supreme being on evidence, you are doing a disservice to faith, in my opinion. You're going to lose a lot of believers that way, because the evidence is evolution is not a theory in crisis. It's up there with the theory of gravity. It's up there with theories, a lot of other theories. So I think, like I said, they can coexist as far as the answering different types of questions for some people. For me, I don't personally need that faith or religion in my life, but for others, they might need it. I say might because you can draw it from other areas like philosophy, for things like meaning and purpose, and it can, for some people might be morals as well, even though, like I said, you can draw that from other places. And I think that our moving away from faith and religious ideas really is what started the scientific revolution. Philosophers and scientists were saying we need to move away from supernatural explanations and move more towards a naturalistic approach. And if we didn't do that, we wouldn't have seen us coming out of the Dark Ages and having this it's called the Enlightenment for a reason, right? A good example of this was Benjamin Franklin, who proposed that lightning and electricity are the same thing. And he said we should put these rods on top of big buildings so they don't get hit by lightning. And the churches were mad and saying, no, you're messing with the will of God. And so if we would have stayed with the people of faith and people with religious explanations, we would have never came to a naturalistic idea of putting lightning rods on top of big buildings. So I guess that's all I wanted to put into that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, you just made the statement that the theory of evolution is like gravity, it's certain. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys are familiar with theory and hypotheses. I'm sure a lot of people are, but just in case you aren't, and especially for other viewers that might see this later, so hypothesis is just an educated guess, right? But in a theory, a scientific theory, like the theory of gravity or the theory of evolution, is put through a rigorous amount of peer review and testing, and they examine it, and it's very hard to become a theory. A theory basically explains facts. And so the theory of evolution has gone up there to a theory, just like gravity. Gravity is a theory that no matter what, no matter how many times, if you drop something, it will fall. So they're in the same category as far as being, there's a consensus of it. It's been peer reviewed. It's been examined over and over and over again, and has come out without it being falsified.
What role does prediction play in those theories? Is prediction sort of an important part of whether a model is correct or incorrect?
Oh yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I like to think of the prediction of Tiktaalik. Are you guys familiar with Tiktaalik?
Go for it.
Okay, that's one of my favorite intermediate fossils. It was founded by Neil Shubin and his colleagues. And Tiktaalik is the intermediate fossil between water and land. So it's a very unique specimen that was found on Ellesmere Island. So they noticed that there was, like the fossil record is going to have gaps, and that's because, like I said, it's very hard to become a fossil. But they noticed there was a huge gap between fish and amphibians. And so they thought, they looked at this map, Neil Shubin and his colleagues looked at a map and thought, where would we find an intermediate fossil between land or fish, water and land? And so they looked at a map and they saw that there was rocks of the right age and the right type that have not yet been looked at, and they were from the Devonian period, the time of the fish. And so they went up to Ellesmere Island because that's where it was at, and nobody has looked at this this particular land except for saying, mapping out that this is Devonian rocks. And so they predicted that this is where this specimen would be, and it took them a long time because they kept finding little like marshes and they kept finding lake beds, but they were finding animals from more deeper areas. We were looking for an animal that is closer to shallow water, and so they kept looking for an Ellesmere Island, and finally, after some years, they found it. They was popping out of a cliff, and they found several specimens of Tiktaalik, and it is a perfect intermediate fossil because it has lungs. It has gills. It has, and this is the first time that we see our structure of our hand. The first time that we see a one bone, two bones, lots of bones, and digits. It's the first time we see an aquatic animal being able to turn its head and have a neck. And this was probably for the purposes of coming out of the water and like looking around, making sure that it was safe. And it was and also it had a flat head. Fishes have conical heads, but it had fin-like. First tetrapods are four-footed animals, and it was just perfect. And they were able to predict where this animal would be. And this is just one example of the predictions that science can make.
You were agreeing with that when I think we fired that off. You said that prediction is important. I heard a yes from over here. So I was curious, where do you feel prediction and prophecy sort of fall into the same world, or are those two different kinds of things?
Apples and elephants.
Okay.
Which is to say no. Science, two things that I think kind of got mixed here. Gravity can be tested today. Mm-hmm. You can test it tomorrow. Testing whether something is a transitional fossil is not a laboratory test that can be repeated. That would be the difference. It does not fall into the inductive reasoning. It falls into the abductive reasoning. So I make that differentiation.
Yeah. But I would counter that with people studying microbial evolution have been able to, by doing this over the last 10, 20 years, have been able to follow microbial evolution because that process happens very quickly and you can go through a number of generations. It's not explaining long-term, vertebrate evolution, but the principle is there to follow changes and mutations in DNA and what might come out of that.
Both Steve and I happen to believe in microevolution.
Oh, okay.
I differentiate that between macro.
Oh, all right.
So microevolution, fine.
Okay.
Microevolution can lead to macro.
I was going to ask, how do you define macro, micro? Like, what would your breakout be?
Yeah. If a graduate student is working with fruit flies and they try different mutations, at the end, what you end up with is fruit flies. When you see a virus evolve, to be more drug resistant, at the end of the day or its life, it's still a virus. That's macroevolution. Birds can change their beak color. That's microevolution. I'm totally on board with that. Not a problem. What I'm seeing is when you say that thus and such was a transitional fossil, that's an assertion. I will give a brief illustration of that. What is an assertion? It's a statement that says, this is the way it is. If I were to make a statement to you that says, I can run a mile in less than 8 minutes, that's an assertion. Give you a little background. I've been a runner for 40 years. I run 3 times a week. Would you believe I could run a mile in 8 minutes or less?
No.
Yes. Okay, jury's out. Suppose I make the assertion that I can run a mile in 4 minutes or less.
Nope.
No, not even. My best time was in the middle 5s when I was in high school, when I was in shape. So an assertion is nothing more than a statement, and it needs representative facts to back it up. And to say this is a transitional fossil, it's a fossil. It's got a conical instead of round head or whichever it is, fine. how do we know it's transitional? It's an assertion. How do we know it's transitional?
There are both amphibian features and fish-like features. This is another prediction that evolution makes, that we'll find these fossils that have some features of one species we know and another species we know. And this is just one example of prediction. There was a prediction of Uranus being out there as well. There's a lot of other examples of predictions. Halley's Comet was a prediction as well, and unfortunately, the person that predicted it to be around every 75 to 76 years wasn't around when it actually came. But those are just some examples. The only thing you need to disprove evolution is finding fossils where they don't belong in the stratum. So the Earth has these layers, and these layers will tell you a relative date of each the specimens within that layer. So in Devonian, you will never find mammals in Devonian rocks. You will never find dinosaurs with humans in that same age of rock. So all you need to do is find something like that, and then the theory of evolution is totally out of the window. Because every theory is still out for being disproven, but so far it just hasn't been.
Could I point out, there was a recent paper in the journal Nature that came out like a week or two ago, where scientists from San Diego Museum of Natural History found a butchered, I think it was a mastodon, and they dated it to, in California, they dated it to 130,000 years ago. Now this is like entirely out of the realm that we have ever thought. We thought early man in North America was 15,000, maybe 18,000, maybe you could go 45,000. If you had something down weird in South America. This has just come out 130. This blows apart this is the sort of thing where this blows apart all sorts of things. But their evidence was they found these bones, and they were found quite a while ago, and it was the way in which they were butchered. And it seemed as though it was only a human that could take a rock to the end of these bones. Now, to me, it was like, what was Homo sapiens doing 130,000 years ago? There's like no evidence that they were ever in North America. So, something like this comes out, it's published in a big paper. This goes right into your story about, what's going on, because humans have not been found in North America that long of a period of time. So this is like the tension and the activity that you find as a scientist. Do I believe this data? When I heard about it, I was like, I snarfed that I didn't believe this at all. It was like Homo sapiens wasn't over here. But that's just, a belief that I had at the time. If it was scientifically correct, oh my God, that changes everything that we think about humans moving all over the globe. That's mind-blowing. Right. I mean, but it's one paper, and
It is, and it still doesn't fall out of line with how long humans have been around. So it's very plausible, but it's still up for,
So it seems like, evidentially, what you're saying is it shows like there's lots of age. It just shows that we seem to know that there's been a lot of time. Mm-hmm. So has there been any discoveries that have sort of counteracted that? Is there anything that's made you think like, oh crap, maybe it's not that old. Maybe this thing is out of place, or this process doesn't quite work in this framework we've built, and I can't explain this in any way with our model.
There's a lot of things that I looked at and it's not explained, but like how you said, that doesn't take away from anything. It just means we don't have an answer for it yet, and we might not ever have an answer for it, and that's fine. I've come to that conclusion that I'll be fine, even though I do like answers. There's a lot of mysteries out there. I'm a fan of like crime novels and things like that, and so there's a lot of famous, like the Black Dahlia, one of my favorites, and it's just like we'll never know. Maybe we'll never know who did that. So those kind of things like get to me. Like I want to know, but the mystery kind of makes it appealing as well, So.
Was there one shooter or two? I've had people try to pin me down on it, and I say, I don't know. And that's, there we go. And my honest answer is, I don't know. And when I tell people I don't know, they believe me. Yeah, for what it's worth. I find it interesting that science is a bit of a moving target. That what is true today. Does anybody remember Time magazine cover on cold fusion?
Oh, yeah.
And this was the greatest thing since sliced bread and the
Yeah.
wheel. It was testable, but nobody could duplicate it. And after different people on different continents tried to duplicate it and said, it kind of went the way of, high-button shoes. It went away because it was testable, but it wasn't duplicatable. So science is somewhat of a moving target. There were times when people thought, rightly or wrongly, that the Earth was flat. We since figured it out. There was a time when people thought that the sun revolved around the Earth for whatever reason. We figured that out. Actually, the most shocking was slightly tainted by a mindset. Sometimes it just, well, this is what I think the Bible says, so that's the way it is. Not understanding the Bible and not understanding science. That's a bad combination. It's my belief that the Bible, properly understood, and science, properly understood, will agree. Now, there's two ifs there. One of the curious things was, I'm going to take you a little history lesson here. This guy named Aristotle, he postulated that the universe was infinite and self-sustaining. And that was a common belief up till about 100 years ago. It was disturbed by a guy by the name of Albert Einstein, who came up with a little paper with a couple of little thoughts. And one of the fallouts of Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, by the way, which has been proven to 15 decimal places over the last 100 years. So that's, jury's out, jury's back on that one. That's solid. He didn't like the fact that his theory predicted that the universe was expanding. Bugged him. He actually put a fudge factor in his equations. You're nodding your head. You actually understand this. Good for you. And not too many other nods of the head there. And later on, he had a meeting. I have a photo back in my files of him meeting with a guy by the name of Edward Hubble. They named some telescope after him, I think. The picture is him standing in the Mount Palomar Observatory in California, looking and seeing the red shift of the stars, where Hubble said, hey, the stars are getting further apart from each other. What? If you take a balloon, you blow up a balloon and glue little buttons on the outside of the balloon and blow it up some more, every button is getting further away from every other button. And that's what Hubble said. He probably said it better. But Einstein realized, you're right. And about the 1940s, the scientific community began to believe, maybe the universe does have a beginning. But one of the reasons they were treading very lightly, it stepped on everybody's belief, and also it had, dare I say this, theological implications. But by about 1960, it was about half and half. Then when we launched a couple of the Cobus satellite, it took pictures of the background radiation up, never mind, technical stuff. But basically, the jury is back. The Big Bang. By the way, you know where that name came from? One of the famous astronomers at the time, Fred Hoyle, said this expanding universe is ridiculous. It goes against my worldview. It makes no sense. These are a bunch of Big Bang theories. The name stuck, and it turned out that there's probably half a dozen, maybe a dozen different Big Bang theories. What they agree on is the universe started very, very small, very, very hot, and expanded. And it's expanding today. So it took about 60, 70 years for science to turn the corner. And part of the trepidation about doing it was the fact that it had theological implications. Because the first book of the Torah, which is the Jewish first book, starts off with a curious phrase. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Implied in the Hebrew is created from nothing. And that's very disturbing. And Krauss has his theories, Dawkins has his theories, and right now it's very unsettled. But the scientific community took 60, 70 years to turn the corner based on new evidence. And that's real science. Science is a moving target. It isn't nailed down yet.
Yeah, science is a moving target. I would like just to extend this back to the question of astrobiology, of are we alone? And we're at the point now that telescopes are out there and they're going to fly. James Webb is going to be online fairly soon, where you're going to be able to, not only can we find these planets that are around other stars, but possibly we'll be able to tell whether they have Earth-like atmospheres on here. And you know, when you start to think about it, because we watch Star Trek and all these other things, and my mother would ask me, she'd say, "Didn't you find life on Mars yet?" And I was like, "No, not yet, Mom." And it was like, and people would say, "Haven't we sent a spaceship out to another galaxy?" You know, but these, I mean, this is something that not in my lifetime, and maybe, but in the younger generation's lifetime, we could find evidence of another potentially habitable planet that's going to give such fascinating ideas about God and creation and origins of life. We are on the cusp in the next 100 years of tremendous enlightenment, and where we go from that, I think, is going to be extraordinary.
That's all I can say.
Can I get in? Can I get in here for a minute?
Yes,
Sir,
yeah.
please.
This is too sciencey for me. The only sciencey thing I can add to this is that my cousin sat next to Albert Einstein on a bench eating lunch at Caltech.
Okay.
That's about it.
Nice.
But everything you've said basically is all coming from an evolutionary paradigm that has a certain set of assumptions that cannot be proved. And so you're making your statements based on these assumptions as if they were true. If I were a scientist and of the opposite persuasion, I could look at the same evidences and come to different conclusions based on different set of assumptions. So we don't have those scientists here today. I have no clue what you're talking about. So I can't refute in that sense. But in the sense of paradigms, like I said, I want to get under what's the world view and what is the paradigm of all the statements that scientists make. If I adopt that, what am I proving? The law of gravity, basically. Okay, I want you to walk out of this room and to prove to somebody outside this room scientifically that I did that. And you can't do that.
You can't prove you were born scientifically.
Right. I had a teacher come up to me after I talked about dating methods in my classroom, and he holds up a rock. He's a biology teacher, and he holds up a rock. He says, "This rock's dated at whatever millions of years." And all the kids that I just had said, "Wait a minute. That's based on at least 5 assumptions that you can't scientifically demonstrate." And so as soon as the bell rang, he is up in my class, in my face. "What are you telling these kids?" I said, "Mike, relax. Science can't prove everything." I said, "I want you to prove to me scientifically that you were born." And he looks at me and he goes, "Well, all you have to..." You're right, I can't do that.
It's not repeatable.
It's not observable.
Why wouldn't you ask your mother?
Huh?
Why wouldn't you
That's
ask your mother?
historical. That's historical
I mean,
information.
my mother would
Yeah.
certify that I was born.
That's
She
historical
was there.
information, not scientific. It's historical. And that's what and so a lot of what you're saying basically is based on
but
fake assumptions in the past.
Yeah. You know, you could go down that argument and path. I could see, I mean, I think that's, I'll say it, a ridiculous argument. If you want to debate evolution, it's very complicated, and I could see that there are different perspectives on that. It's an idea that I think is a very complicated and a very broad thing, and not easy to understand. And when I explain it to my students in college, It's hard. It's a hard thing to explain, but I don't think that just because something is difficult that it doesn't mean that I couldn't explain it or it couldn't be explained.
I didn't say you couldn't explain being born. I said you couldn't do it scientifically.
I could do it scientifically.
How?
I'm not going to be put on the spot by that because that's the way scientists would take in that question and would come back and answer you after they considered what that question
He was a scientist.
Yeah, I'll stop.
I just want to say that I think it's a false dichotomy to differentiate between historical science and science. They're both sciences. Historical science deals with experiments all the time, and they do a lot of observational. They use a lot of observational techniques. I know in archaeology we find bones with, like you said, cut marks on them, and we can observe that, and that is a science, even though we're dealing with historical science.
Oh, it's definitely a science, but it's not a hard science like seeing if ivory soap floats. I differentiate because it's not repeatable, it's not testable. It's science. There's a number of sciences that take in the intelligence aspect. If you're digging up and you see this, you dig up this stone from some monument someplace and it's got writing on it, it's not just a natural product. There was intelligence behind it. So it's a different flavor of science than something that can be tested and repeated like ivory soap. It's science, yes. It's a little different flavor.
So with the differentiation between hard and soft sciences, I guess. I know, right? I know. My
biology.
My teachers hated that too. But for what you're saying, things that are a little more testable, repeatable, evidentiary, I guess, chemistry, physics, things like that, things that are consistent throughout our experimentation. Do you feel that those are consistent throughout history as well? So those would be relative tools to use for historical sciences?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay.
We tend to believe that gravity was working even back, when the critters were crawling.
Sure. So light traveling, last Tuesdayism isn't a thing, like that kind of stuff. Like we can assume that the universe has been consistent throughout time.
That in my mind is what opened up the scientific revolution, realizing that things are regular and can be studied. Did open up the scientific revolution in the 1700s, 1800s.
So in determining if you were born, our evidence for that is that everybody's born, and we don't have anybody who wasn't born. So wouldn't you be able to use some of those hard sciences to prove something historical?
Proving historically versus proving scientific, they're different.
Maybe not prove, maybe high degree of competence.
High
Maybe
degree of
that's a better way
confidence.
to put
There
it.
you go.
Okay.
So throwing into that, it was like earth science, which is, a very broad thing, studying the earth, and saying soft and hard, it was like, woo, we get a little miffy on there. You can go back and take ice cores, which we all know about. You can go and take an ice core, and you can go through there and measure the amount of carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the water in that ice core and very accurately determine how much CO2 was in the atmosphere over time. Now, that's not soft science, but that is long-term. You're going back a couple 100,000 years ago. We don't know the cause of that per se, but we do know very accurately how much was in there. That's hard science. I call this stuff wiggly line science. A lot of my colleagues make a measurement in really old rocks, and it goes this way and it goes that way, and they're interpreted. And it was like, I'm a biologist. I should know more about. But it's part of the process that we go through.
Isn't it fun?
Yeah, I think it's fun. Yeah, I like the wiggly
So how do we
line.
make that step from that hard science to that historical science? How do you bridge that gap then?
You have experts. I mean, there are people who train for years and years. If you had asked me, 40 years ago when I was a graduate student or a young postdoc, I was like, what would I know? Why should you ever, pay any attention to me? But I've studied this field for a very long time. I look at scientific data and, it's like, it's by looking and keeping an open mind as to what could be the explanation of the findings that you have.
Sure. Now, because an ice core You drill down in Antarctica and you can go down quite far and you see different layers. You say, man, that one's dirty. That must have been when Mount Pinatubo put a bunch of ash in the air. And yeah, that's real data. And that doesn't take a whole lot of interpretation. Just to say, yeah, that's year by year. Looking at tree rings. You say, yeah, there's a ring per year. I can figure that out. That doesn't take a lot of interpretation. Some scientific discoveries require more interpretation, and you have to be careful about bringing in a mindset that is truly open rather than it's got to be this way. And I'm for an open mind.
So it sounds like biases is a big problem, right? That I think everybody's kind of agreeing, like you got to
Yeah.
avoid the biases.
Agendas.
Yeah, the biases and your agendas, your sort of underlying wants. Maybe you want something to be true instead of it actually being true. How do you methodologically sort of limit your biases when you're looking at evidence and determining sort of historical truth? How do you make sure that you're not being biased in that method?
You have to recognize your biases in the first place and recognize how your bias is affecting your interpretation. And that's what it would come down to.
Yeah, life on Mars was the case. It was in 1994 when NASA had a big, conference saying that they've discovered life on Mars, and the meteorite Ellen Hills 84001 was like, we're in this field, and it came down to like NASA said it was true, and it was like then there was a big slugfest. This went back and forth, and it started out with belief. Some people believed this. They held on to it to their dying day, but it was all about belief. And then there was data on there, and everyone fought over it. They had the same data, and the way they interpreted the data was completely different. Now, over time, that was 1994, this is 2017, and I've had my hands on a piece of Ellen Hills 84001, and, the conclusion was, it was earth contamination. There was weirdness in the way they measured things, and this was not evidence of life. But that's the scientific method, is to get this and to argue over it. But there were people going, back to your question, straight into that with bias.
Are there any tools to kind of catch that? I mean, do you guys, is there in that methodology, what do you use?
I would agree that you would have to recognize your biases. There's a lot of times where I want something to be true, but that doesn't take away from what the results were. A good example of that when I tutor earth science and I tutor geology at Chaffey College, and there's lots of times where students come in with research that they've been doing as a requirement for the class. And, there was several topics that were brought up when I took the class about a particular specimen that was found named Nanotyrannus. And Nanotyrannus was said to be a different taxa than Tyrannus, the Tyrannosaurus rex. It was said to be a different taxa. So as much as I would love to think that there was a smaller T-Rex and it was its own species, it was actually found that it wasn't. It was just a juvenile T-Rex. So when I found that out, it was just like, from Jack Horner, famous paleontologist who cracked open these bones, or rather one of his students did, we're able to see that it was just through lags. So lags are through other methods. Like the lags are similar to tree rings on bones, and we're able to see it was just juvenile. So, or I'm also looking into thermal regulation of dinosaurs. So were they warm-blooded or were they cold-blooded?
Huge debate.
Yes, it is a huge debate. And they thought they had found a four-chambered heart, which is a mammal characteristic, or an endotherm or warm-blooded characteristic. And it was really, it was not a heart, but people wanted to think it was a heart. That would have kind of threw the debate one way or the other. But and when I first heard of it, I was hoping that it was, but it, you just had to go with what, go with the evidence, like you said, and that was the evidence. It was not a four-chambered heart. So So yeah, those are the things that you got to do as someone who's in the sciences, is to recognize those biases. And a lot of the time, since I'm just an undergrad student, so I'm barely beginning my own research, is a lot of the topics that I'm diving into, I don't really have an opinion about them because it's the first time that I'm hearing about it. For instance, I'm going to be looking at a hadrosaur, and I'm going to be doing some research on the hadrosaur and describing a hadrosaur, which is a plant-eating dinosaur. And there's really I know the basics of a hadrosaur, but I'm not making any conclusions about the hadrosaur as far as like maybe how it lived. I could only describe what I see. So yeah.
So it sounds confusingly enough that everybody's got the right process, right? That everybody's making sure we don't have biases, that we're trying to make sure that we're following evidence, that we're not, being prejudiced by our presuppositions. So how do we get from...
That doesn't happen.
Right. So how do we get to a point of consensus? What's the holdup to get to an agreement?
Let's make a very small thing that we agree on. Science is great.
Very
History
specific
is great.
points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you look at what you do agree on, like you said. I'm also looking into language development in humans, and like different fields want to look into that. So you have neurology, you'll have anthropology, you'll have biology, and these are all different fields, and they're all disagreeing with each other. And in a paper I recently wrote, I'm like, I say, well, what do we agree on? Because maybe that's where we can, know that we're in the right direction.
And what do we disagree on and why?
Yeah.
I think the answer, the whole issue is, the whole free speech debate that's going on right now. The answer to bad speech is good speech. Let's have more science. Let's dig out more data. Let's throw every hypothesis we can on the table, and let's move science forward. I'm all for it. I am of the opinion that when properly understood, it will line up with what the Bible teaches properly understood. That's an opinion that would take an hour for me to, and I'm not going to. But I know you're smiling. But
I'm totally smiling.
But I have to be aware of my own prejudices and my own biases. It's a really good point. I think that God is the mover behind it all, which colors the way I look at fossils. You would say it occurred through evolution. It colors the way you look at fossils. And those are mindsets that we really have to take a long, hard look at to know, because otherwise we're looking at data through a funny lens.
Since you said you came out of religion and evolutionary biology and that kind of stuff was part of what, probably pushed you completely out.
It actually wasn't.
The biblical components?
That came later.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you start seeing that stuff sort of stack up, do you feel that evolution was a presupposition for you? Because that's essentially what you're saying is you come at it with your theological presupposition, you're coming at it with a evolutionary presupposition. Do you feel like you came at it from that direction, or you were brought to evolution from evidence, I guess?
From evidence, because I didn't understand the evolution. It was very hard to understand at first. I know that when I first heard about it, I was very religious still, and I remember hearing about it in a class, and then coming home to a very religious mother who I had said, I found out we came from these like very ancient ape people, and she was like, we didn't come from monkeys. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, we didn't, because I saw her as an authority figure, and and she still doesn't believe that, but and it's so I grew up in the Jehovah's Witness congregation, and a majority of them, I think I read in a recent poll from Pew Research Studies that over 70% of them do not believe that evolution happened. And surprisingly, a lot of Christians and different denominations of Christians do believe that evolution happened. Some of them believe that God had a hand in it, though. It was interesting that the congregation I grew up in, and it makes sense that a lot of them did not believe in evolution. I was always told it was not. It was in Jehovah's Witness congregation, a lot of it is attributed to the devil and evil forces, and so it's just basically like it's a way to try to get us to
tests of faith.
Yes, exactly. And so I just totally ignored science in that way, but I was also very intrigued by it, but felt guilty by it. So I was when I went into college, but I was already an atheist at that time, and I had no idea how evolution worked. And, it was through learning in anthropology and biological anthropology, and through that I was able to understand how evolution works with what I would say was pretty much a clean slate, because I did not know how it worked. I was raised to believe it was evil to even inquire about it. So, and it made sense. It all made sense, So that's how
I just kind of wanted to clarify that one. 'Cause
Yeah, for sure.
I felt like you had said you had not come from that sort of presuppositionalism, so.
Yeah.
Another testimony?
Yes, please.
Since I'm probably
And then we're
two to-
probably going to get to our Q&A after this.
2 to 3 times your age, I was brought up on evolution, totally. Didn't know anything else but evolution in the public schools and so forth. When I started teaching, I was teaching basically straight evolution regarding history and so forth. And I went to a lecture, and briefly the lecturer mentioned something about evolution and what has not been taught in schools. And he mentioned a book. So I went on and got that book, and I said, wow, they didn't teach me this. Why didn't they teach me this? They didn't teach me this. So I've spent the last 20, 30 years looking at various options within the context of creation and evolution. And so I became basically, as a result of the evidence that I looked at, that creation was a viable option, evolution within the context of that in micro, which is no problem. But anyway, that was my testimony.
One brief comment about religious traditions. Remember, I used an illustration before about a narrow core of things that we agree on and a wider core of things where it's fun to disagree. I think I would even say a lot of what we're discussing today falls into this outer core. It's great to talk about. It doesn't affect the central core. And different faiths have different outer cores. But the central cores, they should be the same.
So, and I would throw in, evolution and religion for me never intersected at all. I didn't realize the church had an opinion on evolution. I read the Bible cover to cover, recognized my question was, how do you get the virgin birth? I mean, I'm looking at that one, and I'm saying, that's I could say Jesus Christ, we would know he was there, but virgin birth, I don't understand that one. And so that probably was more of my question than was evolution. And
That's sort of a sub-question. Are miracles possible?
And are miracles, and I think that's a great question to debate. Are miracles possible?
Another Sunday.
On another
Yes.
Sunday.
Yeah.
But it was like evolution. I didn't even know there was anything to do about religion and evolution. And it was like, it had nothing to do with my evolving as a scientist, but as a religious person, that was a question. And I like the thought of miracles. I'm not against them, but it was like I believe in life on Mars too. But we all, I'll stop there.
I like the idea of miracles too. I think it'd be fun. I think it'd be fantastic.
They would be very rare.
Right? That's just by
Otherwise, it
definition,
wouldn't be a
I think,
miracle.
right? Yeah. All right. Well, I'm getting the waving of the hands. So again, I want to thank you guys for sticking around and doing this. We're going to do a little Q&A now. So if anybody's got any questions for our panelists, please.
Ask him.
We're going to line kind of up over here at this microphone, if that's fine with you.
Define your terms.
Oh,
Yeah,
we got a
there's
break. We got a 5-minute
there's a
break.
break.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I was just going to roll right into the next thing.